A ruthless millionaire walks into court, smug and untouchable, convinced he owns the system. With cameras rolling, he mocks the black judge presiding over his case, belittling him right in front of the entire courtroom. But just 2 minutes later, the unthinkable happens, his chest tightens, his vision blurs, and he collapses in agony. As the paramedics rush in, there's only one person who can save him. The very man he just humiliated. Will Judge Davis let him suffer, or will he make the decision that changes both their lives forever? And when the millionaire wakes up to find his empire crumbling and his power stripped away, how far will he go to claw his way back? Stay tuned for a gripping story of downfall, redemption, and the moment that no one saw coming. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun glinted off the polished stone steps of the New York Federal Courthouse. News vans lined the street like soldiers at attention, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. The air buzzed with the voices of hundreds of protesters, their signs waving like angry flags in the crisp morning breeze. Police officers stood watchful at their posts, hands resting on their belts, eyes scanning the growing crowd. Wallace is a thief. Lock him up. Justice for the workers. The chants echoed across the courthouse plaza, growing louder with each passing minute. A sleek black limousine pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the chaos around it. The crowd surged forward, pressing against the metal barriers. Camera flashes exploded like lightning as Peter Wallace emerged, straightening his $1,000 tie with manicured fingers. His silver hair caught the sunlight, and his steel blue eyes surveyed the scene with casual disdain. A hint of amusement played across his features as another wave of angry shouts rose from the crowd. 4 attorneys in expensive suits formed a protective wall around him, their shoulders nearly touching. Their leather briefcases swung in perfect rhythm as they climbed the courthouse steps. Wallace's smirk never wavered, even as someone in the crowd hurled a paper cup that landed harmlessly at his feet. Inside his chambers, Judge Benjamin Davis sat at his desk, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. His dark fingers traced each line of the thick case file before him, pausing occasionally to make neat notations in the margins. 20 years on the bench had taught him patience, but something about this case made his jaw clench. The morning light filtering through his window cast shadows across the mountain of evidence. The charges filled page after page: fraud that had stolen retirement funds from thousands of workers, embezzlement that had lined Wallace's pockets while emptying others, exploitation that had crushed small businesses and ruined lives. Davis had seen corruption before, but rarely so bold, so shameless. Each document told another story of lives destroyed by unchecked greed. He removed his glasses and rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar tension headache building. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy coat. As a black man who had fought his way up through a system that hadn't wanted him, he'd faced plenty of Peter Wallaces, men who thought their money made them untouchable, who saw his position as an amusing aberration. Their smirks always faded eventually. The knock at his door signaled it was time. Judge Davis stood, adjusting his robes with practiced movements. His reflection in the window showed what everyone would see: calm, composed, unreadable. He straightened his spine, ready to face whatever games Wallace might try to play. The main courtroom was packed to capacity, with people squeezed shoulder to shoulder on the wooden benches that creaked under their weight. Reporters clutched their notepads, legal observers whispered among themselves, and curious onlookers craned their necks for a better view. The air felt thick with anticipation, heavy with the weight of expectation. Peter Wallace's entrance drew all eyes. He moved like he owned the room, each step purposeful and measured, nodding to his legal team as they arranged themselves at the defense table. His Italian leather shoes squeaked softly on the polished floor, the sound somehow emphasizing the arrogant tilt of his chin. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs. All rise. The Honorable Judge Benjamin Davis presiding. Judge Davis emerged from his chambers, his steps measured and deliberate. The room fell silent as he took his seat, his presence filling the space without effort. His dark eyes swept across the courtroom, taking in every detail, from the nervous shuffle of the court reporter to the defiant stance of the defendant. The lead prosecutor, a woman with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun, approached the podium. Her opening statement laid bare the ugliness of Wallace's crimes, her voice steady and controlled as she detailed each offense. She spoke of deleted records, of offshore accounts, of desperate employees who lost everything while Wallace bought his fourth yacht. Her words painted a picture of calculated cruelty and bottomless greed. Wallace leaned back in his chair, looking almost bored. His fingers drummed a quiet rhythm on the table as the prosecutor continued, the gold of his watch catching the light with each movement. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth, as if he were watching an amateur performance that amused him. Judge Davis's gavel cracked like thunder, the sound echoing off the high ceiling. Court is now in session. His voice carried authority without needing to raise it, commanding attention through sheer presence. The prosecutor resumed her statement, but Wallace was already turning to his lead attorney, his expensive cologne wafting across the aisle. His whisper carried just far enough for those nearby to hear, "This is cute. They think they have something on me." Judge Davis caught the whispered words, saw the smirk, noticed the casual arrogance in Wallace's posture. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the defendant's display of confidence. He'd seen that same arrogance crumble countless times before. The morning sun continued to stream through the high windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. Dust motes danced in the beams of light, swirling like tiny stars above the proceedings. The trial of the decade was officially underway, and the air crackled with unspoken tension. In the gallery, a young woman clutched a photograph of her father, one of Wallace's victims, her knuckles white with suppressed emotion. A hush fell over the courtroom as Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen approached the evidence table. Her heels clicked against the marble floor with purpose as she lifted a thick stack of documents, her shoulders squared with determination. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the papers in her hands. "Your Honor, the government presents Exhibit A through F." She gestured to the overhead screen, her voice clear and unwavering. "These documents show a complex web of shell companies Mr. Wallace created to hide billions in stolen funds." The screen filled with flowcharts, each box connected by arrows that twisted and turned like snakes. Company names appeared and disappeared, money flowing between them in dizzying patterns. The sheer complexity of the scheme drew quiet gasps from the gallery. "As you can see," Chen continued, using her laser pointer to trace the money trail, "Mr. Wallace funneled pension funds through no less than 12 different shell companies." She pointed to specific transactions, her finger steady and sure. Here, and here, all leading back to his personal accounts in the Cayman Islands. Wallace didn't even glance at the screen. Instead, he examined his manicured nails with exaggerated interest, occasionally brushing invisible lint from his tailored suit. His attorney whispered something urgently in his ear, but Wallace waved him off with a flick of his wrist, as if shooing away an annoying fly. "The evidence shows that Mr. Wallace stole over $4 billion from hardworking Americans' retirement funds." Chen's voice grew passionate, her words carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "Teachers, firefighters, nurses, all robbed of their life savings by a man who already had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes." The gallery murmured, the sound like angry bees. Several elderly victims in the front row dabbed at their eyes with crumpled tissues, their hands trembling. Wallace stretched in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him, as if he were lounging at a boring business meeting. "Your Honor," Wallace interrupted, standing up despite his lawyer's attempt to grab his sleeve. He stretched his arms overhead as if he were at a country club rather than a federal courthouse, his gold cufflinks catching the light. "This is a waste of time. We all know how this ends." Judge Davis's dark eyes flashed, but his expression remained neutral, a mask of judicial composure. His hands folded carefully on the bench before him, fingers interlaced with practiced calm. "Mr. Wallace, I suggest you sit down and show appropriate respect for these proceedings." "Respect?" Wallace laughed, the sound sharp and hollow, echoing off the high ceiling. "For what? This circus?" He turned, scanning the courtroom with contempt before fixing his gaze on Judge Davis, his lips curling into a sneer. "Figures. A diversity hire. Let me guess, equity and inclusion put you here, not competence?" The courtroom erupted in shocked gasps. Several jurors' mouths fell open, their faces registering disbelief and disgust. Even Wallace's own attorney looked horrified, his face turning pale as he tugged desperately at his client's sleeve, whispering frantic warnings. But Judge Davis didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. His expression remained as still as carved stone, only his eyes betraying the intensity of his focus on Wallace. The silence stretched for one long moment, heavy with tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. "Are you finished, Mr. Wallace?" Davis asked, his voice steady and controlled, carrying the weight of decades of earned authority. Wallace's lips curled into a smirk, his eyes glittering with malice like a predator sizing up its prey. He leaned forward, placing both hands on the defense table with an air of casual defiance. "Oh, I'm just getting started." The room held its collective breath, the air thick with anticipation. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, frozen in place. The bailiff's hand drifted toward his belt, ready for trouble. But Judge Davis simply watched Wallace, his calm presence making the defendant's outburst seem all the more childish by comparison, like a toddler's tantrum before a mountain. Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen straightened her blazer and smiled slightly, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her sleeve. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Michael Torres to the stand." Wallace's perfectly maintained composure flickered for a split second. His jaw tightened, though he quickly masked it with his usual arrogant smile, the one he'd perfected over years of board meetings and press conferences. But Judge Davis had caught that momentary slip, the first real crack in Wallace's carefully constructed facade. Torres walked to the witness stand, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if carrying an invisible weight. He was a middle-aged man in a simple gray suit that had seen better days, his thinning hair neatly combed. He looked exactly like what he was, a mid-level accounting executive who had spent 20 years keeping his head down and doing his job, never expecting to end up in the spotlight like this. "Mr. Torres," Chen began, her voice clear and measured, "what was your position at Wallace Enterprises?" "I was senior financial controller for the North American division," Torres replied, his voice steady despite the weight of Wallace's stare burning into him from across the courtroom. "And in that capacity, what did you discover?" Wallace's lawyer jumped to his feet, his expensive suit rustling. "Objection, Your Honor. This testimony wasn't included in the original discovery." "Your Honor," Chen countered smoothly, "Mr. Torres only came forward 3 days ago. We submitted an emergency motion to amend." "Which I granted," Judge Davis interjected calmly, his deep voice carrying authority without having to raise it. "Objection overruled. Continue, Ms. Chen." As Torres began describing the elaborate network of offshore accounts and falsified records, Wallace's fingers drummed against the defense table in an increasingly agitated rhythm. His lawyer slid a yellow legal pad toward him with a pointed look, but Wallace pushed it away with barely concealed irritation. Chen projected a series of emails onto the courtroom screen, the blue-white glow illuminating the tension in the room. "Mr. Torres, could you explain these communications?" "These are emails between Mr. Wallace and the Board of Global Trust Bank," Torres explained, pointing to specific passages. He instructed them to transfer pension funds into account 274B in the Cayman Islands. But that account wasn't listed in any official records. "Not one." Wallace's smirk faltered, the corner of his mouth twitching. His eyes darted to his lawyer, who was frantically scribbling notes, the pen making scratching sounds in the hushed courtroom. "And what happened to those funds?" "They were split into smaller amounts and filtered through shell companies," Torres continued, gaining confidence as he spoke. "Eventually, they ended up in Mr. Wallace's personal accounts. Every single penny." Chen methodically walked Torres through document after damning document. Bank statements. Transfer records. Internal memos marked confidential in bold red letters. With each new piece of evidence, Wallace's practiced confidence seemed to crack a little more, like a sheet of ice splintering under too much weight. "Mr. Wallace assured us it was all legal," Torres continued, his voice growing stronger. "He said the board had approved everything. But when I checked the records myself..." Wallace leaned toward his lawyer, whispering harshly through clenched teeth. "They have nothing. It's all circumstantial. Where's the proof I ordered any of this?" His manicured hand gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. But his voice carried a new edge, something almost like desperation, unfamiliar in a man who had always radiated absolute certainty. His usual languid posture had stiffened, his shoulders tight with tension beneath his $1,000 suit. From his position on the bench, Judge Davis observed it all with practiced neutrality. He noticed how Wallace's manicured nails now dug into his palms, leaving little half-moon indentations. How his breathing had quickened slightly, his chest rising and falling in an uneven rhythm. How his eyes kept returning to the evidence screen, then darting away like someone avoiding their own reflection. The mask of untouchable arrogance was slipping, revealing glimpses of something else underneath. Fear? Uncertainty? For the first time since the trial began, Wallace looked less like an empire and more like a man, one who was beginning to realize that his money might not be able to buy his way out of this one, that his usual escape routes were closing one by one. Judge Davis had seen many powerful people in his courtroom over the years, had watched them perch in expensive suits on the edge of their downfall. He knew the moment when they first sensed their power crumbling, when they realized that all their wealth and influence might not be enough to save them. That moment was playing out before him now, in every subtle shift of Wallace's expression, in every forced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, in every nervous adjustment of his silk tie. The carefully constructed armor was beginning to crack, hairline fractures spreading across its surface. And through those cracks, the truth was finally starting to seep through, like water finding its way through stone. Wallace leaned back in his chair, that familiar smirk playing across his face as Torres fumbled through his oath. But suddenly, something changed. Wallace's smug expression vanished, replaced by confusion. His right hand flew to his chest, clutching at his expensive silk tie, his manicured fingernails digging into the fabric. "Mr." Wallace tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His face contorted in pain, beads of sweat breaking out across his forehead. The color drained from his face, leaving him ghostly pale under the harsh fluorescent lights that seemed to highlight every bead of perspiration. His lawyer, Richard Stanford, noticed first. "Peter? Are you all right?" Stanford's hand hovered uncertainly over his client's shoulder. Wallace's breathing became rapid and shallow, like a trapped animal's. He tried to stand but stumbled, knocking over his water glass. It shattered on the floor, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent courtroom, water spreading across the polished tiles like spilled mercury. "I can't," Wallace gasped, his knees buckling. Stanford caught him before he hit the ground, the lawyer's expensive briefcase clattering to the floor beside them. "We need medical help," Stanford shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. "My client needs immediate medical attention." His usually composed demeanor crumbled as he struggled to support Wallace's weight. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Spectators jumped to their feet, craning their necks to see, their whispers growing into a concerned murmur. Reporters scrambled for their phones, already dialing their editors, fingers flying across keypads. The prosecution team exchanged worried glances, while the court officers rushed forward, their shoes squeaking against the floor. Wallace lay on the floor now, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face contorted in agony. His breathing came in short, desperate gasps, each one more labored than the last. "Help," he wheezed, all traces of his former arrogance gone, replaced by raw fear. "Please." The court officers radioed for emergency services, their voices tight with tension. "Medical emergency in courtroom 4B. Possible heart attack. Need immediate response." Their words crackled over the radio, adding to the growing tension. Within minutes, paramedics burst through the heavy wooden doors, pushing a gurney, its wheels squeaking against the floor. They knelt beside Wallace, their movements quick and professional, equipment clattering as they worked. One placed an oxygen mask over his face while another checked his vital signs, their latex gloves snapping as they worked. "BP's through the roof," one paramedic announced, her stethoscope pressed against Wallace's chest. "Pulse is irregular. We need to get him to the hospital now." Sweat beaded on her forehead as she worked. But the U.S. Marshals stepped forward, their faces grim, hands resting instinctively on their weapons. "He's in federal custody," one stated firmly, his badge catching the light. "We can't release him without proper authorization." The paramedic looked up, frustration clear on her face, her dark eyes flashing. "This man needs immediate cardiac care. Every minute counts." Her hands never stopped moving as she spoke, checking Wallace's vitals. "I understand," the marshal replied, shifting his weight uncomfortably, "but protocols must be followed. We need judicial approval." His hand tightened on his belt. The tension in the room ratcheted higher. Wallace's lawyer spun toward the bench, his face flushed. "Ty Askew." "Your Honor, please. My client." The paramedic cut in, her voice sharp with urgency. "He needs to be in an ER within the next 15 minutes, or we're looking at possible permanent damage. Maybe worse." Her partner was already preparing in 4-line, the needle glinting under the fluorescent lights. All eyes in the courtroom turned to Judge Benjamin Davis. He stood slowly, his expression completely unreadable as he surveyed the scene before him. Wallace lying helpless on the floor, the paramedics poised to act, the marshals standing firm, and a room full of people holding their breath, the air thick with anticipation. The judge's dark eyes moved from Wallace's prone form to the anxious faces of the medical team, then to the stern expressions of the marshals. His hands rested on the bench, his fingers spread wide against the polished wood as he rose to his full height, his black robe settling around him like a shadow. The courtroom fell absolutely silent, waiting for his decision. Even Wallace's labored breathing seemed to quiet as Judge Davis stood there, straight-backed and imposing in his black robes, holding the power of life and death in his next words. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking each precious second that slipped away. Wallace lay sprawled on the polished courtroom floor, his designer suit wrinkled and his chest heaving with each labored breath. Sweat darkened the collar of his white shirt as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. His manicured hands clawed weakly at the marble beneath him, seeking purchase where there was none. The mighty had fallen, literally, and now he looked small and vulnerable against the cold marble. Judge Davis descended from his bench, his black robes flowing behind him as he moved with measured steps toward the fallen billionaire. The courtroom fell silent except for Wallace's ragged breathing, the usual shuffle of papers and whispered conversations dying away instantly. As Davis knelt beside him, their eyes met. Gone was Wallace's trademark arrogance, replaced by raw fear that made him look decades younger and infinitely more human. "Stay with us, Mr. Wallace," Davis said firmly, his deep voice steady and calm, the same voice that had commanded respect throughout the trial. "Medical help is on the way." Wallace's fingers clutched weakly at Davis's sleeve, his perfectly manicured nails catching on the fabric. His lips moved, but no sound came out, just shallow gasps for air. The judge pressed 2 fingers against Wallace's neck, counting the rapid, irregular pulse that fluttered like a trapped bird beneath his skin. The paramedics burst through the heavy wooden doors, equipment in hand, their boots squeaking against the polished floor. They quickly surrounded Wallace, their practiced movements efficient and urgent. One attached monitoring leads to his chest while another slipped an oxygen mask over his face, the plastic immediately fogging with each desperate breath. "Blood pressure's dropping," one paramedic announced, her voice tense. "We need to move him now." The lead paramedic turned to Judge Davis, his expression grave. "Your Honor, we need authorization to remove him from custody for emergency medical treatment. Without your signature, we can't transport him. Protocol requires it." Wallace's eyes locked onto Davis. The fear in them was naked now, primal, stripped of all pretense. His hand reached out, trembling like a leaf in autumn. "Help me," he wheezed behind the oxygen mask, the words barely audible. "Please." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. The man who'd sneered at Davis's authority, who'd dismissed him as a diversity hire during countless pretrial motions, now depended entirely on his decision. Wallace's life literally hung in the balance, waiting for the stroke of a pen from the very judge he'd mocked and belittled throughout the proceedings. Davis stood perfectly still for a moment, his expression unreadable, years of judicial composure masking whatever thoughts might be racing through his mind. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick enough to cut. Then, without a word, he took the clipboard from the paramedic. His pen moved across the paper in one fluid motion, authorizing Wallace's release for medical treatment. "Get him to the hospital," Davis ordered, his voice firm but calm, brooking no argument. The paramedics wasted no time. They transferred Wallace onto a stretcher, strapping him down securely with practiced efficiency. The oxygen mask fogged with each desperate breath as they wheeled him toward the door, the stretcher's wheels rattling against the floor. The gathered crowd parted silently, watching as the once powerful Peter Wallace was rushed away, his life now in the hands of strangers. Through the open doors, camera flashes exploded as reporters caught sight of the scene, their shouted questions echoing in the hallway. The man who'd arrived that morning in a luxury car, surrounded by an army of lawyers, was now being loaded into an ambulance. His perfectly tailored suit was rumpled, his carefully styled hair disheveled, his face ashen beneath the oxygen mask. All his wealth, all his connections, all his power, none of it mattered now. The heavy doors swung shut behind them with a resounding thud, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. Judge Davis stood motionless, watching the space where Wallace had lain moments before. The marble floor still bore the scuff marks from the paramedics' boots, dark streaks against the pristine surface, the only evidence remaining of how quickly fortune could turn, how swiftly the mighty could fall. The steady beep of hospital monitors filled the sterile room as Wallace opened his eyes. The cotton sheets felt rough against his skin, nothing like the silk he was used to. And dripped clear fluid into his arm, and the hospital gown made him feel exposed, vulnerable. The harsh fluorescent lights cast unfamiliar shadows across the room, making everything feel alien and unwelcoming. He reached for his phone on the bedside table, hands trembling. No new messages from his children. He'd tried calling them 5 times since being admitted, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that went unanswered. Their silence hurt more than the chest pain that had brought him here, a deep ache that no medication could touch. "Mr. Wallace?" A nurse entered, checking his vitals with practiced efficiency. "Your lawyer is here." She adjusted his foreline and made a quick note on his chart before stepping aside. Marcus Chen, his lead attorney, walked in looking exhausted. His usually pristine suit was wrinkled, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. His briefcase, once gleaming leather, looked as worn down as its owner. "Peter, we need to talk." Wallace tried to sit up straighter, wincing at the sharp pain in his chest. "Tell me you've unfrozen my accounts." His voice carried a hint of desperation he couldn't quite hide. Chen shook his head slowly. "The prosecution has ironclad evidence. Every attempt we've made has been blocked. Your primary residence, the summer house, even your cars, they're all frozen. The judge's orders were comprehensive. What about my emergency funds? The offshore accounts?" Wallace's fingers clutched at the rough hospital blanket. "Found and frozen." Chen's voice was heavy with resignation. "Peter, I've been your lawyer for 15 years. I've never seen a case this solid against you. Maybe it's time we discuss a plea deal. It might be your only option left." Wallace's face flushed with anger, the heart monitor beeping faster. "A plea deal? I don't do plea deals. I win. That's what I do, it's who I am. Not this time." Chen gathered his briefcase, looking older than Wallace had ever seen him. "The evidence is overwhelming. Your own employees are turning against you. Think about it, really think about it. You're not the man you used to be." Meanwhile, across town in his chambers, Judge Benjamin Davis sat reviewing Wallace's case files. Photos of Wallace's victims covered his desk, elderly couples who lost their retirement funds, single parents who lost their savings, small business owners driven to bankruptcy. Each face told a story of broken dreams and shattered trust. Davis picked up a photo of the Wallace family from a magazine article, Peter Wallace standing proudly with his 3 children at a charity gala. The kids were all grown now, successful in their own right, but their silence toward their father spoke volumes. The contrast between the smiling faces in the photo and the current reality was striking. His clerk knocked and entered with a stack of additional files. "Your Honor," the hospital called. "Mr. Wallace is stable. They're keeping him for observation, but he should be able to return to court in 3 days. His doctors want to monitor his heart." Davis nodded, still studying the photo, remembering Wallace's desperate eyes on the courtroom floor, the way he'd begged for help. It was the first real thing Davis had seen from the man, no manipulation, no arrogance, just raw human fear. Perhaps that moment of vulnerability revealed something worth saving. "Sir?" his clerk asked, hovering by the desk. "The prosecution wanted to know if you'll consider their motion to revoke bail entirely when he returns." Davis set down the photo, running his hand over his tired eyes. The law was clear, Wallace's crimes warranted severe punishment. The evidence was overwhelming. But Davis hadn't become a judge to destroy lives. He'd done it to serve justice, and sometimes justice meant more than punishment. It meant finding the path to redemption, however difficult that might be. Tell them I'll hear arguments from both sides, Davis said finally, his voice firm but thoughtful. Everyone deserves a chance to change. The question is whether Mr. Wallace truly wants to. Back in the hospital, Wallace stared out his window at the city skyline, his city, or so he'd always thought. The towers he'd once dominated now seemed to mock him. Now he couldn't even access enough money for a decent meal, reduced to hospital food and charity. The hospital TV droned quietly, showing news coverage of his case. His own face flashed across the screen, followed by crowds of angry protesters outside the courthouse holding signs demanding justice. He picked up his phone again, fingers trembling as he scrolled through old photos of happier times, his daughter's college graduation, his son's wedding, family vacations in places he could no longer afford to visit. When had he last really talked to them? Not about business or appearances, but really talked? He couldn't remember, and that realization stung worse than any legal defeat. The phone slipped from his fingers onto the blanket, landing with a soft thud that seemed to echo his fall from grace. For the first time in decades, Peter Wallace felt truly alone. The city lights twinkled outside his window, indifferent to his suffering, as night settled over a world that no longer belonged to him. The quiet hum of medical equipment filled the hospital room as Judge Davis stepped inside. Wallace's eyes widened, and he struggled to sit up straighter in his bed, wincing at the movement. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his pale face, highlighting the dark circles under his eyes. "You?" Wallace's voice was hoarse, lacking its usual commanding tone. A thin sheen of sweat covered his forehead. Davis crossed his arms, his face stern but composed. His polished shoes clicked against the linoleum floor as he approached. "You have 5 minutes." Wallace stared at the man he'd mocked just days ago. The judge's presence felt different here. No flowing black robes, no elevated bench, just a man in a pressed suit standing beside a hospital bed. Yet somehow, he seemed even more imposing. The weight of authority clung to him like an invisible mantle. I don't understand," Wallace managed, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his blanket. "Why are you here?" "I wanted to see it for myself," Davis said quietly, his deep voice carrying through the sterile room. The great Peter Wallace, without his armor of wealth and influence. Just a man in a hospital gown, facing his mortality like everyone else. Wallace's jaw tightened. Even now, a flash of his old defiance surfaced, like a dying ember trying to reignite. "Come to gloat then?" "No." Davis pulled up a chair but didn't sit. The metal legs scraped against the floor, the sound sharp and jarring. "I came because I needed to know if what I saw in that courtroom was real. The fear in your eyes when you thought you were dying. The way you looked at me, not as a diversity hire, but as someone who held your life in his hands." Wallace's face flushed with shame. The memory of his cruel words hung between them like a physical presence. The steady beeping of his heart monitor seemed to grow louder in the silence. "My assets are frozen," Wallace said, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "My kids won't talk to me. Everything I built." He trailed off, staring at his hands, now stripped of their expensive rings and gold watch. "Everything you stole," Davis corrected firmly, his words precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "Let's be clear about that." Wallace didn't argue. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the distant sounds of hospital activity filtering through the closed door. "When I was lying there," Wallace started, then stopped. He swallowed hard, his throat working visibly. "When I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I realized something. All the money, all the power, it meant nothing. I couldn't buy another breath. I couldn't bribe my heart to keep beating." Davis watched him intently, his expression unreadable. His steady gaze seemed to pierce through Wallace's remaining defenses. "You could have let me die," Wallace continued, his voice cracking slightly. "After what I said to you, no one would have blamed you for hesitating." "That's where you're wrong," Davis said, shifting his weight slightly. "I took an oath to uphold justice, not to play God. Your life or death wasn't my decision to make. Your punishment will come through the law, not through vengeance." Wallace's shoulders slumped. For the first time in decades, he looked his age, tired, vulnerable, human. The hospital gown seemed to swallow his once imposing frame. The trial resumes next week, Davis said, his tone professional but not unkind. Your medical team says you'll be well enough to attend. The evidence against you hasn't changed. The consequences haven't changed. I know, Wallace whispered, his fingers picking absently at a loose thread on his blanket. 4 minutes left, Davis said, checking his watch. The soft tick of its hands seemed to count down the moments. Is there anything else you'd like to say? Wallace looked up, meeting the judge's steady gaze. The arrogance that had defined him was gone, replaced by something raw and uncertain, like a mask finally stripped away. I'm sorry, he said. Not just for what I said to you. For everything. Davis studied him for a long moment, his eyes taking in every detail of Wallace's changed demeanor. Words are easy, Mr. Wallace. Even now, you could be playing another angle. Time will tell if you mean it. The monitor beeped steadily as Wallace absorbed these words. His hands clutched the thin hospital blanket, knuckles white with tension. A nurse passed by in the hallway, her shoes squeaking on the polished floor. Your 5 minutes are almost up, Davis said, stepping back from the bed. His shadow retreated across the floor. I'll see you in court next week. Wallace slumped back against the hospital pillows, his designer hospital gown a stark reminder of his desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of his former status. The steady beep of the heart monitor echoed his racing thoughts, each pulse a reminder that even his health couldn't be bought anymore. I don't know who I am without money, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt raw, honest, something he hadn't been in decades. His throat tightened around each syllable, as if his body itself rejected this newfound vulnerability. Judge Davis stood at the foot of the bed, his presence as commanding in this sterile room as it had been in his courtroom. His arms remained crossed, his expression unchanged by Wallace's confession. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the years of wisdom etched there. Then figure it out, Davis replied, his voice firm but not cruel. The simple directive hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and challenge. Wallace's hands trembled as he gripped the thin hospital blanket. The weight of his situation crashed over him like a tidal wave. His mansion was empty, his children's silence deafening, his empire crumbling. The mirror on the opposite wall showed a pale, diminished version of the man who once commanded boardrooms. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his cheeks had hollowed with stress and worry. How? Wallace's voice cracked. Everything I've ever been. Everything I've ever done. It was all about the money. He gestured weakly at the hospital room, at the generic artwork on the walls and the squeaky vinyl chairs. Look at me now. I can't even get a private room anymore. Davis took a step closer, his shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. The sound echoed in the small space like a judge's gavel. Maybe that's exactly what you need, to see the world without your golden shield. Wallace let out a bitter laugh that turned into a painful cough. His chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Seeing me brought low? No. Davis's response was immediate and sincere. His dark eyes held Wallace's gaze steadily. Justice isn't about enjoyment, Mr. Wallace. It's about truth. And sometimes, the truth hurts. Wallace's face contorted with emotion, anger, fear, and something deeper, shame. The monitors beeped faster as his pulse quickened. My father always said a man's worth was in his wallet. I believed him. I lived it. I taught my own children the same thing. His voice grew quieter, almost disappearing beneath the hospital room's ambient noise. And now they won't even take my calls. Money didn't make those choices, Mr. Wallace. You did. The words hit Wallace like physical blows. He turned to look out the window, where the city skyline stood against the afternoon sun, buildings he used to own parts of, towers where his name once shone in golden letters. Now they seemed to mock him with their distant grandeur. I don't know how to be anything else, he admitted, his voice hollow. The confession echoed off the sterile walls, making him feel smaller with each reverberation. Then figure it out, Davis repeated, but this time his tone carried a different weight. That's not a suggestion, Mr. Wallace. It's your sentence. Find out who Peter Wallace is when he can't buy his way through life. Wallace looked back at the judge, seeing not the diversity hire he'd mockingly accused him of being, but a man who'd earned every step of his journey. A man who knew exactly who he was, with or without status symbols. The realization made Wallace's stomach twist with shame at his past prejudices. And what if I can't? Wallace asked, hating how vulnerable he sounded. His fingers picked nervously at a loose thread in the blanket. Then you'll have failed at the most basic task of being human, knowing yourself. Davis checked his watch, the simple timepiece a stark contrast to the diamond-encrusted one Wallace used to wear. Your 5 minutes are up. Wallace lay in his hospital bed, the muted glow of the TV casting harsh shadows across his gaunt face. His fingers trembled as he clicked through news channels, each one displaying his downfall in vivid detail. Breaking news, Wallace empire crumbles, flashed across the screen. The once proud CEO watched helplessly as footage showed federal agents raiding his corporate offices, carrying out boxes of evidence. His chest tightened, but this time it wasn't a heart attack, it was something deeper, more painful. The reporter's voice cut through his thoughts. Sources say the fraud scheme may have affected over 10,000 employees' pension funds. Wallace's eyes fixed on images of former employees being interviewed. An elderly janitor wiped tears away, describing how he'd lost his entire retirement savings. A young mother held her child, explaining how she couldn't afford her daughter's medical treatments anymore. These were faces he'd never bothered to notice before. Names he'd dismissed as numbers on spreadsheets. Now their pain was impossible to ignore. The TV showed his mansion being seized, luxury cars being towed away. His phone lay silent beside him, no calls from his children, no messages from his so-called friends. The hospital room felt smaller by the minute, the walls closing in around him. Who the hell am I? He whispered, his voice cracking. The words hung in the sterile air, unanswered. For the first time, he couldn't hide behind designer suits or expensive watches. His reflection in the dark TV screen showed just a man in a paper-thin hospital gown, looking old and lost. He thought about Judge Davis's words, then figure it out. But how? His whole life had been built on wealth and power. Every decision, every relationship, every moment had been filtered through money. Without it, the world felt foreign and frightening. The news switched to footage of his courtroom collapse. There he was, sprawled on the floor, gasping for air while Judge Davis, the man he'd insulted and mocked, saved his life. The memory made his cheeks burn with shame. Wallace reached for the remote with shaking hands, but couldn't bring himself to turn it off. Another headline scrolled across the screen. Wallace's children distanced themselves from disgraced father. His daughter's statement played next. I can't defend what my father did. Those people trusted him, and he betrayed that trust. Her words cut deeper than any legal document or news report. He pressed his palms against his eyes, but couldn't block out the truth. Everything he'd built was a lie. Every achievement was stained. Every victory had come at someone else's expense. Who the hell am I? He whispered again, his voice barely audible over the steady beep of hospital monitors. The question echoed in his mind, demanding an answer he didn't have. The man who had once commanded boardrooms with a single gesture now couldn't even look himself in the eye. The billions he'd accumulated, the power he'd wielded, it had all been a mask. Now that mask was gone, shattered on the courtroom floor alongside his arrogance. He glanced at the door, half expecting his lawyer or some reporter to burst in. But there was only silence. No one was coming to save him. No amount of money could fix this. For the first time in his life, Peter Wallace was truly alone with himself, and he had no idea who that person was. With shaking hands, Wallace picked up the hospital phone. He'd memorized Davis's office number from the court documents. Each digit he dialed felt like another piece of his armor falling away. Judge Davis's chambers, a secretary answered. This is Peter Wallace. I need to speak with him. His voice cracked, unfamiliar even to himself. There was a long pause, then shuffling papers. One moment. Wallace held his breath, half expecting to be dismissed. But then Davis's deep, steady voice came through the line. Mr. Wallace. Wallace swallowed hard. The words stuck in his throat. Gone was the smug billionaire who'd mocked this man in court. How do I fix this? The silence that followed felt endless. Wallace could almost see Davis sitting at his desk, probably in that straight-back chair, expression unreadable as always. You don't, Davis finally replied, each word deliberate and heavy. You own it. Wallace gripped the phone tighter. What does that even mean? I can pay people back. I can. No, Davis cut him off. You're still thinking like a rich man who can buy his way out of trouble. That's not owning it. That's trying to fix it. Then what? Wallace's voice rose with frustration. What do you want from me? It's not about what I want, Davis said. It's about those people whose lives you destroyed. The janitor who lost his retirement. The single mother who can't afford her child's medicine. You don't fix their pain. You own it. You carry it. You let it change you. Wallace felt tears burning in his eyes, real tears, maybe for the first time since he was a child. I don't know how, he whispered. That's the first honest thing you've said since this trial began, Davis responded. Start there. Stop trying to control everything. Stop trying to win. Just own it. The words hit Wallace like physical blows. He thought about his own children, who wouldn't even visit him. He'd taught them the same lessons his father had taught him, that money was everything, that power meant never having to say sorry. I'm scared, Wallace admitted, the words barely audible. Good, Davis said. That's what owning it feels like. The line went dead, leaving Wallace alone with his thoughts and the weight of Davis's words. He looked around his hospital room, no flowers, no cards, no visitors. Just the consequences of a lifetime of putting wealth above humanity. For the first time, he didn't try to scheme his way out. He didn't look for an angle or an escape route. He just sat there, letting himself feel the full weight of what he'd done. The news of Wallace's disappearance spread quickly through the courthouse. Judge Davis sat in his chambers, fingers drumming against his polished desk as he read the hospital report. Wallace had simply walked out, no dramatics, no elaborate escape. He'd just left. Davis knew better than to think Wallace had fled the country. The man's accounts were frozen, his passport flagged. No, this was something else. After several phone calls and careful consideration, Davis found himself driving through the deteriorating streets of Wallace's old neighborhood. The area had seen better days. Abandoned buildings lined the cracked sidewalks, their windows boarded up or broken. Wallace's childhood home stood at the end of a dead-end street. The Victorian mansion, once grand, now loomed like a decaying giant. Paint peeled from its walls in long strips, and weeds had overtaken what used to be manicured gardens. Davis parked his car and approached the rusty front gate. It creaked open at his touch. As he walked up the path, he noticed fresh footprints in the dust. Inside, the house was a museum of neglect. Sheets covered old furniture, and cobwebs decorated every corner. Davis's footsteps echoed on the wooden floors as he moved through the rooms. He found Wallace in what must have been the study. The billionaire sat in an old leather chair, staring at a large portrait above a cold fireplace. It showed a stern-faced man in an expensive suit, Wallace's father. I used to think he was the strongest man in the world, Wallace said without turning around. His voice was hollow, empty of its usual arrogance. Funny how things change. Davis remained in the doorway, observing. Wallace looked smaller somehow, his expensive suit wrinkled and dusty. The hospital called, Davis said quietly. Wallace nodded slowly. I needed to see this place again. To remember. He gestured weakly at the room. He made his fortune the same way I did. Stepping on others. Breaking rules. Breaking people. His laugh was bitter. I spent my whole life trying to be him. And now? Davis asked. Wallace finally turned to face him. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face haggard. Now I realize I succeeded. He looked back at the portrait. And it terrifies me. Davis stepped into the room, dust motes dancing in the dim light filtering through dirty windows. The air was heavy with decades of secrets and shame. You know what the worst part is? Wallace continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't even blame him anymore. Every choice I made, every person I hurt, every rule I broke, that was all me. I chose this. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of confession and recognition. In this decaying shrine to power and privilege, something was breaking down in Wallace, and maybe, just maybe, something new was trying to emerge. Davis moved closer, studying the portrait of Wallace's father. The same cold eyes, The same proud tilt of the chin. The same emptiness. Choosing to be him was your first mistake, Davis said. Now you have a different choice to make. Wallace's hands gripped the arms of the chair until his knuckles turned white. I don't know how to be anyone else. The abandoned house loomed before them, its paint peeling and shutters hanging crooked. Wallace sat on the worn front steps, looking smaller somehow without his expensive suit and carefully maintained appearance. His hospital gown had been replaced with plain clothes that seemed to hang off his frame. Davis approached slowly, his footsteps crunching on the overgrown gravel driveway. Wallace didn't look up. "This is where it all started," Wallace said, his voice hollow. "Right here on these steps." He ran his hand along the weathered wood. "I was 10 when my father made me watch him fire our housekeeper. She'd worked for us for 15 years, raised me since I was a baby. She was crying, begging him to reconsider. She had 3 kids to feed." Davis remained standing, silent but attentive. "You know what he told me after she left?" Wallace's voice cracked. He said, "That's how you handle the help, son. The moment they think they're family, cut them loose. Money is power, and power means never letting anyone close enough to hurt you." Wallace looked up at the house's broken windows. "Every lesson was like that. When I got an A in math, he made me sleep in the garage until I could prove I deserved a bed. When I showed mercy to a business rival in high school debate club, he didn't speak to me for a month. My father built this empire on broken people. And I..." Wallace's shoulders slumped. "I became exactly what he wanted. Worse, even. At least he was honest about being a monster." Judge Davis finally spoke, his voice level. "And now? Now?" Wallace laughed bitterly. "Now I'm sitting on the steps of a condemned house, talking to the judge who's going to send me to prison, wondering if I ever had a chance to be different." "That's not what I asked," Davis said firmly. "I asked what you're going to do about it." Wallace blinked, caught off guard. "Do?" "Yes, do." Davis crossed his arms. "You've told me why you're broken. Fine. But what are you going to do about it? Are you going to sit here feeling sorry for yourself, blaming a dead man for your choices? Or are you going to stand up and decide who Peter Wallace is going to be from this moment forward?" Wallace stared at him, mouth slightly open. For the first time, there was no trace of the smug billionaire, no hint of the manipulator. Just a lost man facing the truth of his life. "I don't." Wallace swallowed hard. "I don't know how to be anyone else. So what are you going to do about it?" Davis repeated, each word deliberate and challenging. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and consequence. Wallace looked down at his hands, hands that had signed documents that ruined lives, hands that had built an empire on suffering. Then he looked up at Davis, something new flickering in his eyes. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Peter Wallace stood before the bench. Gone was the designer suit, replaced by a simple navy blazer that seemed to hang loose on his thinner frame. His usual smirk had vanished, leaving behind tired eyes and deep lines around his mouth. Judge Davis sat in the back row, barely noticeable among the crowd. He watched intently as Wallace gripped the podium, his knuckles white with strain. "Your Honor," Wallace began, his voice rougher than before. "I'd like to make a statement." The judge presiding over the hearing nodded. The room fell silent. Wallace cleared his throat. "For 40 years, I built what people called an empire. I convinced myself it was through skill, through being smarter than everyone else." He paused, swallowing hard. "But that was a lie. I stole. I cheated. I destroyed lives." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks. "The pension funds." Wallace's voice cracked. "Those weren't just numbers on a page. They were people's futures. Retirements. Dreams." He looked down at his hands. "I took that from them because I could. Because I thought being powerful meant being right." From his spot in the back, Davis noticed how Wallace's shoulders trembled slightly. "My father taught me that kindness was weakness," Wallace continued. "That only fools play fair. I believed him. I became exactly what he wanted, a man who saw people as things to be used." A woman in the gallery began to cry softly. She had lost her entire savings to Wallace's schemes. "I can't undo what I've done," Wallace said, looking directly at her. "I know that. But I'm here to take responsibility. Every charge, every accusation, they're all true. And I'm ready to face the consequences. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. No one had expected this from the man who once bragged about being untouchable. I don't ask for mercy, Wallace said firmly. I don't deserve it. What I did was calculated, deliberate, and wrong. I hurt people because I could profit from their pain. That ends today. Davis watched as Wallace's admission seemed to physically transform him. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like dignity. To everyone I've harmed, Wallace's voice grew thick with emotion. I know these words mean little compared to what you've lost. But I am sorry. Truly, deeply sorry. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Even the most hardened reporters looked stunned. This wasn't the carefully crafted statement of a PR team. This was raw, honest, painful truth. From his seat, Davis remained still, his expression neutral. But inside, he felt the weight of this moment. He had watched Wallace's journey from that first day in court, from mockery to crisis, from denial to this moment of brutal honesty. Wallace straightened his shoulders, facing the consequences of his actions head on. I'm ready for whatever sentence the court deems appropriate. I only ask that any restitution possible be made to those I've wronged. The judge presiding over the hearing leaned forward, studying Wallace carefully. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. In the back row, Davis watched as the man he'd once seen as nothing but corruption incarnate showed what real change looked like. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. The federal courtroom was silent as Peter Wallace stood before Judge Benjamin Davis for sentencing. Gone was the designer suit, replaced by a simple gray outfit that seemed to hang loosely on his thinner frame. His face, once marked by arrogance, now showed something different, acceptance. Your Honor, Wallace began, his voice steady but humbled. I don't stand here today asking for mercy or leniency. I've had time to think about everything I've done. The lives I've ruined. The people I've hurt. He paused, swallowing hard. For the first time in my life, I understand what it means to have nothing. And somehow, that's given me everything I never knew I needed, clarity. Judge Davis studied the man before him, noting how Wallace's shoulders no longer carried that entitled swagger. The judge's dark eyes remained stern, yet thoughtful. The money, the power, it was all a shield, Wallace continued. I used it to hide from who I really was. A coward. A thief. Someone who thought rules didn't apply to him. His voice cracked slightly. I was wrong. The judge leaned forward slightly. Mr. Wallace, you've pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and corporate exploitation. The minimum sentence is 15 years. Do you understand this? Yes, Your Honor. Wallace nodded, then added something that made several people in the courtroom exchange surprised glances. And I accept it. Not as a punishment, but as a chance to make things right. Judge Davis's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered in his eyes. Very well. This court sentences you to 18 years in federal prison. The gavel struck, and Wallace was led away. 3 days later, Judge Davis visited Wallace at the federal prison. The meeting room was sparse, just a metal table and 2 chairs. Wallace sat straight-backed in his orange jumpsuit, hands folded on the table. I didn't expect to see you here, Wallace said quietly. Neither did I, Davis replied, taking the seat across from him. But I needed to understand something. What's that? If this change is real. Davis's gaze was penetrating. I've seen many men find religion or remorse when they're facing consequences. Most forget at the moment they think they're in the clear. Wallace nodded slowly. I used to think being powerful meant being untouchable. Now I know true power is facing what you've done. He met Davis's eyes. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I haven't earned it. No, you haven't, Davis agreed. Redemption isn't given, Mr. Wallace. It's earned through actions, not words. Through consistent choices made when no one's watching. I understand that now. Wallace's fingers traced an invisible pattern on the table. You know, when you signed that release in the courtroom, when I was having that heart attack, I couldn't understand why. I'd insulted you, mocked you, tried to diminish you. Because that's what justice means, Davis said firmly. Not revenge. not punishment for its own sake. Justice is about doing what's right, even when it's hard. Even when the person doesn't deserve it. Wallace absorbed these words, nodding slowly. You taught me something I never learned in all my years of buying and selling power. Real strength isn't about control over others. It's about control over yourself. Remember that, Davis said, standing up. Redemption is earned every day, Mr. Wallace. One choice at a time. As Davis turned to leave, Wallace called out softly, "Thank you, Your Honor. Not for mercy, but for justice." Davis paused at the door, looking back at the man who had once seemed untouchable, now humbled but somehow more dignified in his prison orange than he'd ever been in his $1,000 suits. "Prove it was worth it, Mr. Wallace. That's all I ask." Judge Benjamin Davis sat in his chambers late one evening, the city lights twinkling through his window. His desk was neat as always, case files arranged in perfect order. But tonight, his attention was fixed on a simple white envelope bearing the stamp of the Federal Correctional Institution. With careful fingers, he opened the letter, recognizing the now familiar handwriting of Peter Wallace. The paper was plain, prison issued, the ink blue and slightly smudged. "Dear Judge Davis. I've written this letter a dozen times in my head. Each version seemed wrong, too formal or too casual. How do you thank the person who saved your life by taking everything away? For 40 years, I measured my worth in dollars. My father taught me that power was everything, and I believed him. I built towers of glass and steel, but I was hollow inside. Empty. That day in court when my heart gave out, I thought I was dying. Maybe, in a way, I was. The old Peter Wallace did die that day. The man who thought he was untouchable. The man who mocked you and everything you stood for. You could have let me suffer. After what I'd said to you, no one would have blamed you. But you showed me something I'd never understood before. True power isn't about control or money. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. These prison walls have taught me more than all my years in boardrooms. The men here, they see me for who I am, not what I own. For the first time in my life, I have to earn respect. Real respect. I help teach literacy classes now. There's a young man here who reminds me of myself at his age, angry, scared, hiding behind a mask of toughness. Yesterday, he read his first complete book. The pride in his eyes. It meant more than any business deal I ever closed. You didn't just sentence me, Judge Davis. You gave my life meaning. You showed me that redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about building a better future. I know I'll spend many more years here, and I should. But, thanks to you, these aren't empty years. They're full of purpose. With sincere gratitude. Peter Wallace. Davis set the letter down slowly, letting out a long breath. The setting sun cast warm shadows across his desk, and for the first time since the trial began, he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a slight upturn of his lips, but it carried the weight of vindication. He thought back to that day in the courtroom, Wallace gasping on the floor, and how close he'd come to hesitating. But he'd seen something in Wallace's eyes then, not just fear, but the first crack in a lifetime of walls. Running his fingers over the letter one more time, Davis opened his desk drawer and carefully placed it inside. The smile remained on his face as he gathered his things to head home. Sometimes, justice wasn't just about punishment. Sometimes, it was about transformation. The morning sun cast long shadows across the prison yard as Peter Wallace stepped through the heavy metal gates for the last time. He carried nothing but a small cardboard box containing a few photographs, some letters, and the worn paperback books that had kept him company during his sentence. The guard nodded at him. "Good luck, Wallace." 5 years had weathered his face, etched new lines around his eyes. His once perfect suit had been replaced by simple jeans and a plain white t-shirt. His designer watch was gone, leaving a pale strip of skin on his wrist where it used to sit. He stood there for a moment, taking in the world beyond the fence. No reporters waited to ambush him. No protesters held signs demanding justice. No lawyers rushed to offer representation. The silence felt strange but somehow right. A city bus pulled up to the curb. Wallace watched it, remembering how he used to mock people who took public transportation. Now, he pulled out his bus pass, one of the few things the prison release program had given him. As he climbed aboard, An elderly woman smiled at him. He smiled back, not because he wanted anything from her, not because it would help close a deal or impress anyone. Just because it felt natural. The bus wound through the city streets. Through the window, Wallace caught glimpses of his old life, the financial district where his empire had once stood, the exclusive restaurants where he'd closed million-dollar deals, the luxury car dealerships where he'd bought vehicles on impulse. None of it stirred anything in him anymore. He thought about his father's voice, always pushing for more, always demanding power. That voice had grown quieter during his time inside, replaced by other voices, his fellow inmates sharing their stories, the prison counselor's patient guidance, and Judge Davis's words that had finally broken through his walls. The bus stopped in a modest neighborhood. Wallace stepped off, adjusting the box under his arm. A small apartment waited for him, nothing fancy, just a studio with basic furniture. His parole officer had helped arrange it. As he walked down the street, he passed a coffee shop. Through the window, he spotted Judge Davis sitting alone, reading the morning paper. For a moment, Wallace considered going in, saying something profound about his transformation. Instead, he just kept walking. He had learned that real change didn't need an audience. It didn't need validation or recognition. It just needed to happen, one quiet step at a time. His apartment building came into view, old brick, window units humming, laundry strung between buildings. Nothing like his former penthouse. But as he climbed the stairs, he felt something he'd never experienced in all his years of wealth and power: peace. Wallace unlocked his door, set down his box, and walked to the window. The view wasn't of the city skyline anymore, just a small courtyard where kids played and neighbors chatted. He watched them for a while, these people living their ordinary lives. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to be extraordinary. He didn't need to prove anything. He didn't need to be the richest, the most powerful, the one in control. He just needed to be. Taking a deep breath, Wallace turned away from the window. His new life waited, simple, humble, and entirely his own. No empire to maintain, no image to project, no power to chase. Just one step at a time, moving forward. The steady beep of the heart monitor pierced the darkness of Peter Wallace's hospital room. At 2 a.m., the halls were quiet except for the soft footsteps of night nurses making their rounds. Wallace lay motionless in his bed, staring at the ceiling tiles, counting them over and over as if they might reveal some hidden truth. His CFO's betrayal played on repeat in his mind. Marcus. 20 years of trust, shattered in an instant. The evidence Marcus had handed over to the prosecution would destroy everything Wallace had built. Every dirty deal, every manipulated number, every stolen penny, all exposed. A nurse poked her head in, clipboard in hand. "Everything okay, Mr. Wallace?" she asked, her voice gentle. Wallace didn't respond, didn't even blink. She made a quick note and moved on, her shoes squeaking softly against the linoleum floor. Across town, Judge Benjamin Davis sat in his study, a cold cup of coffee forgotten on his desk. Sleep wouldn't come tonight. The weight of Wallace's case pressed down on him like a physical thing. He'd seen countless criminals in his courtroom, but something about Wallace was different. The man's arrogance had crumbled, revealing something raw underneath, something almost human. Back in the hospital room, Wallace's fingers twitched against the thin blanket. The heart monitor's rhythm increased slightly as he pushed himself up, grimacing at the pain in his chest. His hospital gown felt paper-thin in the cold air as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. His first step was unsteady. His knees shook, threatening to buckle. But Wallace gritted his teeth and forced himself forward. One step. Another. Each movement sent shooting pains through his chest, but he didn't stop. The security camera in the hallway caught his shuffling figure, a ghost in white, moving slowly past the nurse's station. Nobody noticed. Nobody stopped him. The man who once commanded boardrooms and bent laws to his will now slipped away like a shadow. 10 minutes later, the night nurse returned for her check. The empty bed sent her into a flurry of activity. Calls were made. Security was alerted. But Wallace had vanished into the night, leaving nothing behind but rumpled sheets and a disconnected heart monitor. At home, Judge Davis's phone rang, cutting through the quiet of his study. He picked it up, already knowing what he would hear. "Your Honor, The voice on the other end was tense. Wallace is missing. He left the hospital somehow. Nobody knows where he went. Davis sighed heavily, rubbing his temples with his free hand. The irony wasn't lost on him, the mighty Peter Wallace, running away like a common criminal. But Davis knew. He'd seen something in Wallace's eyes during that last court session, something that told him exactly where the fallen billionaire would go. He set the phone down slowly, the weight of responsibility settling over him like a heavy cloak. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions. But for now, in the quiet darkness of his study, Judge Benjamin Davis sat with the knowledge of Wallace's whereabouts, contemplating what justice truly meant for a man who had lost everything, including himself. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the sky was beginning to lighten, painting the abandoned mansion in shades of gray. Peter Wallace sat on the crumbling front steps, his hospital gown replaced by clothes he'd kept stashed in an old emergency bag. The massive house loomed behind him, its windows dark and empty like dead eyes. The sound of tires on gravel broke the morning silence. Wallace didn't turn as Judge Davis's car pulled up, its headlights sweeping across the overgrown lawn. He heard the car door open and close, followed by measured footsteps approaching through the dew-wet grass. "Took you long enough," Wallace said, his voice rough. He kept his eyes fixed on the iron gates at the end of the driveway, now rusted and hanging crooked. Davis stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, saying nothing. The morning air was cool, and Wallace could see his own breath as he sighed. "This is where it all started," Wallace continued, gesturing weakly at the mansion. "My father built an empire from nothing. But he built it with fear, and I became him." His shoulders slumped as the words left him. "Every time I made someone feel small, every time I used money as a weapon, I was just copying him." He'd stand in his office up there, Wallace pointed to a second-floor window, and tell me that kindness was for the weak. That the only way to succeed was to make others fear you. A bird called somewhere in the distance. Wallace ran a trembling hand through his hair, now disheveled and graying at the temples. "I spent my whole life running from his shadow. Telling myself I was different, better. But look at me now." He gave a bitter laugh. "I became exactly what he was. Maybe even worse." Davis remained silent, his expression unreadable in the pre-dawn light. His presence seemed to demand more, to pull the truth from Wallace like poison from a wound. "I used to hide in the wine cellar when he was angry," Wallace said softly. "I'd promised myself I'd never be like him. But the first time I made $1 million by destroying someone else's company, I felt powerful. Like I finally had control. After that, it was easy to become him." Wallace's voice cracked on the last word. He stared at his hands, once manicured and adorned with expensive watches, now bare and slightly shaking. Davis finally spoke, his voice level and calm. "So what are you going to do about it?" Wallace exhaled, and his breath shook in the cool morning air. "I don't know." Davis turned away, gravel crunching under his shoes as he headed back to his car. At the last moment, he paused. "Then figure it out. Before it's too late." Wallace watched him go, the weight of those words settling heavy on his shoulders. The sky was growing lighter, and for the first time in decades, he felt truly seen in the house that had shaped him into who he was. The sky was turning from black to deep blue, promising another day. Wallace's expensive shoes, now scuffed and dirty, scraped against the worn concrete steps of his childhood home. Behind him, the mansion's shadow stretched across the unkempt lawn like a giant's reaching hand. "I spent my life thinking power made me invincible," Wallace said, his voice barely above a whisper. He ran his fingers through his gray hair, no longer perfectly styled. "Turns out it made me nothing." Judge Davis stood a few yards away, his arms crossed over his chest. The morning breeze ruffled his coat as he studied Wallace with steady eyes. "You're not nothing," he said firmly. "You're just not who you thought you were." The words hung in the air between them. A bird called somewhere in the distance, and Wallace watched a leaf skitter across the cracked driveway. The silence stretched on, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Wallace exhaled, his shoulders dropping. "So, what now?" "That's up to you," Davis replied, his voice neither encouraging nor condemning. He was stating a simple fact. Wallace stood up slowly, his legs still weak from his hospital stay. He turned to face the house, taking in the peeling paint and broken shutters. For the first time, he saw it clearly, not as a symbol of power, but as a monument to fear and control. "I don't want to run anymore," he said, the words coming out rough but certain. Davis took a step forward, his shoes crunching on the gravel. "Then prove it." Wallace nodded, reaching into his pocket. His hand emerged with his phone, no longer the latest model, but a basic burner he'd kept for emergencies. He looked at it for a long moment, turning it over in his hands. "I'll confess," he said. "Everything. The shell companies, the pension funds, all of it. This won't undo the damage," Davis warned, his voice grave. "But it's a start." Wallace's fingers were steady as he dialed his lawyer's number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. He kept his eyes fixed on the mansion's front door, where his father had once stood tall and terrifying. "Hello?" His lawyer's voice crackled through the speaker. Wallace took a deep breath. "It's me. I want to confess." The marble courthouse steps felt different under Wallace's feet this morning. Gone was his usual confident stride, replaced by measured steps that echoed through the grand entrance hall. His Italian suit, though still perfectly tailored, hung differently on his shoulders, like armor that no longer fit. Derek Sullivan rushed to meet him at the entrance, his face tight with concern. "Peter, please reconsider. We can still fight this." Wallace shook his head, a small smile playing at his lips. "No more fighting, Derek. No more games." Inside the courtroom, the familiar buzz of whispered conversations filled the air. But unlike before, Wallace didn't command the room. His presence barely caused a ripple. In the back row, Judge Benjamin Davis sat quietly, his expression neutral but watchful. Prosecutor Helen Martinez arranged her papers at the prosecution table, ready for another day of battle. Her shoulders were tensed, prepared for the usual circus of objections and legal gymnastics that came with prosecuting Peter Wallace. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed through the room. Wallace stood, his hands steady at his sides. When the judge asked for his plea, Sullivan stepped forward, ready to argue for a deal they'd discussed. But Wallace placed a firm hand on his lawyer's shoulder. "Your Honor," Wallace's voice carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. "I'd like to speak." Sullivan whispered urgently, "Peter, don't." But Wallace was already moving forward. He stood straight, his eyes clear and focused. "Everything they're saying is true. Every crime. Every theft. I did it." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Reporters' pens scratched frantically against notepads. Cameras clicked in rapid succession. Martinez's mouth fell open slightly, her prepared argument suddenly unnecessary. Sullivan slumped in his chair, running a hand over his face. His client of 15 years had just thrown away any chance of a reduced sentence. In the back row, Davis remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Wallace. This was the moment he never thought he'd see, Peter Wallace, the man who'd built an empire on lies, finally telling the truth. Wallace continued, his voice steady. "I manipulated markets, created shell companies, stole pension funds. I hurt people. Real people. And I did it because I thought I was above the law." The judge leaned forward, studying Wallace carefully. "Mr. Wallace, you understand what this admission means?" "Yes, Your Honor. I do." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Very well. Sentencing will be scheduled." Wallace exhaled slowly, closing his eyes. The chains of his lies, carried for so long they'd become part of him, finally fell away. He didn't look around the room. He didn't need to see the shocked faces or the frantically scribbling reporters. For the first time in decades, he stood in his truth, and it was enough. The holding cell was a stark contrast to Wallace's penthouse office. No floor-to-ceiling windows, no Italian leather chairs, just cold concrete walls and a metal bench that creaked under his weight. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his face. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, his expensive suit wrinkled from the long day in court. The watch on his wrist, a $50,000 timepiece, now seemed ridiculous. Time wasn't his to control anymore. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Wallace didn't look up, expecting another guard with paperwork. Instead, Judge Benjamin Davis's polished shoes came into view. "Didn't think I'd see you here," Wallace said, his voice rougher than usual. Davis leaned against the wall, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "Didn't think I'd come." The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words. Wallace could hear his own heartbeat, steady despite everything. The man he'd once mocked now stood before him, not as an enemy, but as something else, a witness to his transformation. "Do you regret it?" Davis finally asked, his deep voice calm and measured. Wallace turned to look at the gray wall, studying its imperfections. "Not what I did," he said slowly. "But how I lived." He ran a hand through his silver hair. "Spent my whole life thinking I was building something great. Turns out I was just building walls." Davis nodded, his expression unchanged. He didn't offer words of comfort or forgiveness. That wasn't why he'd come. "I know I can't fix what I broke," Wallace continued, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't expect redemption." "Redemption isn't given," Davis replied, pushing himself off the wall. "It's earned." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. Wallace watched as Davis turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor once more. Alone in his cell, Wallace took a deep breath. The silence didn't frighten him anymore. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the desperate need to fill it with noise, with deals, with power plays. He just sat there, accepting the weight of his choices and the path ahead. The fluorescent light continued to buzz overhead, but Wallace barely noticed it now. He was too busy listening to something else, the sound of his own thoughts, clear and uncluttered by the chaos of his former life. The fluorescent lights hummed in Wallace's cell as he sat cross-legged on his thin mattress, a notepad balanced on his knee. His prison uniform was a far cry from his custom suits, but somehow the scratchy fabric felt honest. Real. He tapped the cheap ballpoint pen against the paper, searching for the right words. "How do you thank someone who saved your life by letting you lose everything?" "Dear Judge Davis," he wrote, then scratched it out. Too formal. "Benjamin," he tried again, then shook his head. Not right either. Finally, he just started writing what was in his heart. "Judge Davis. I've started this letter a dozen times. Words used to come easy to me in boardrooms and press conferences. But those words were always lies. Now that I'm trying to tell the truth, it's harder. You could have let me die that day in court. Sometimes I wonder if that would have been easier. But you didn't just save my life, you gave it meaning. For the first time, I understand what it means to face consequences. To own up to what I've done. The funny thing is, I'm more free in this cell than I ever was in my penthouse. All those years, I was just running. From my father's shadow. From my own guilt. From the truth. Justice had to be served. I see that now. And whatever sentence comes down, I'll accept it. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because it's right. Thank you for not giving up on me when everyone else did. Thank you for seeing something worth saving, even when I couldn't see it myself." He folded the paper carefully, slipped it into the envelope, and handed it to the guard during morning rounds. Part of him hoped it would get lost in the mail. In his chambers, Judge Davis was reviewing case files when his clerk brought in the day's mail. The plain white envelope with the prison return address caught his eye. He recognized Wallace's name immediately. Davis set aside his work and picked up the envelope, turning it over in his hands. The man who had once sneered at him from across his courtroom was now writing him letters from a prison cell. Life had a way of humbling people. He opened the letter slowly, unfolding the paper with careful movements. As he read, his expression remained neutral. Years on the bench had taught him to mask his reactions. But something in Wallace's words reached past his professional detachment. When he finished reading, Davis set the letter down on his polished desk. He leaned back in his chair, looking out his office window at the city skyline, the same view Wallace used to have from his corporate tower. For the first time since this case began, a small smile crossed Davis's face. Not a smile of triumph or satisfaction, but of recognition. Recognition that sometimes justice and redemption could walk the same path. He picked up the letter again, read it one more time, then carefully placed it in his desk drawer. The smile lingered as he returned to his work. The prison yard stretched out under a blanket of steel-gray clouds, a concrete expanse dotted with inmates in matching orange jumpsuits. Peter Wallace sat alone on a weathered wooden bench, his once powerful frame now lean and weathered by time. The book in his hands was worn, a paperback copy of Man's Search for Meaning that he'd read so many times the spine had cracked. 2 years had carved deep lines around his eyes, but they'd also smoothed away the arrogant sneer that once seemed permanently etched on his face. His silver hair, now cut prison short, caught the weak morning light as he turned a page. Nearby, a group of younger inmates played basketball, their shouts echoing off the high walls. Some of the old-timers still whispered about Wallace, the billionaire who'd owned half of New York. A few even tried to curry favor when he first arrived, expecting him to run the place like he'd run his empire. But Wallace had surprised them all. He kept to himself, spoke softly when spoken to, and spent most of his time in the prison library. The other inmates had eventually stopped waiting for him to make a power play. Now they just let him be. A shadow fell across his book. Wallace looked up to see Marcus, one of the prison guards he'd gotten to know. "Mail call's coming up," Marcus said. "Expecting anything?" Wallace shook his head. His children still wouldn't speak to him. His ex-wife had remarried. The empire he'd built had crumbled to dust. But strangely, the thought didn't sting like it used to. He'd filled notebooks with letters, to his kids, to the people he'd hurt, to Judge Davis. Most of them he never sent. The writing itself was enough, a way to drain the poison of his past life. The basketball game ended, and the yard grew quieter. Wallace closed his book, letting his gaze drift to the slice of sky visible above the walls. A cool breeze brushed his face, and he took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp autumn air. Time moved differently now. The minutes didn't feel like enemies to be conquered anymore. The hours weren't weapons to wield against competitors. They just were, and so was he. Across town, in his chambers, Judge Benjamin Davis held a notice from the parole board. Wallace's hearing was approaching. He set the paper down, remembering the arrogant man who'd stood in his courtroom 2 years ago, and wondered about the man who sat in that prison yard now. Back in the yard, Wallace watched a bird circle overhead, completely free in its solitude. He'd learned more about freedom in these confined spaces than he ever had in his sprawling penthouse offices. The silence that once terrified him now felt like an old friend, teaching him things about himself he'd spent a lifetime running from. The guard called out that yard time was ending. Wallace stood slowly, tucking his book under his arm. Other inmates filed past him toward the door, some nodding and greeting, others lost in their own thoughts. He took one last look at the sky, breathing in deeply. Tomorrow would come, just like today had. And for the first time in his life, that thought brought him peace. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the prison washroom, casting harsh shadows across Peter Wallace's weathered face. His fingers gripped the edge of the metal sink as he studied his reflection. The man staring back at him was both familiar and strange, gray hair where there had once been dark brown, lines etched deeply around his eyes and mouth. But it was the eyes themselves that held his attention. They were different now, clearer, steadier. Gone was the arrogant gleam that had defined him in the courtroom 2 years ago. Gone was the desperate fear that had gripped him during his heart attack. In their place was something simpler, a quiet acceptance. He straightened his prison-issued shirt, noting how it hung loosely on his thinner frame. The designer suits and silk ties felt like artifacts from another life. He barely remembered the weight of a Rolex on his wrist or the feel of Italian leather shoes. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. "Time to go, Wallace," the guard called through the door. Wallace took one final look in the mirror. "I'm ready," he said, more to himself than the guard. In the hallway, his lawyer waited, clutching a leather briefcase. "Remember what we discussed," the lawyer said, falling into step beside him. "Focus on your rehabilitation programs. Emphasize your clean record here. Show remorse, but don't overdo it. The board needs to believe you've changed." Wallace shook his head. "I'm just going to tell the truth." "Peter," his lawyer sighed, "this isn't the time for." "It's exactly the time," Wallace cut him off quietly. "That's all I have now. The truth." They walked through the prison corridors, past cells where inmates called out morning greetings. Some still feared him, old habits died hard, but most had come to know him as just another man serving his time. Outside the parole hearing room, Wallace paused. Through the small window in the door, he could see the board members settling into their seats. His heart beat faster, but not from fear. This moment felt important, but not in the way his old victories had. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. His lawyer reached for the door handle, but Wallace stopped him. Wait. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath. When he opened them again, he caught a glimpse of someone settling into a back row seat, Judge Benjamin Davis. Wallace felt a flutter of surprise, then gratitude. Of course Davis would be here. The man who had seen through his facade from the beginning, who had given him a chance when he deserved none, who had challenged him to find meaning beyond money and power. Mr. Wallace? A clerk appeared at the door. They're ready for you. Wallace nodded. His lawyer started forward with another piece of advice, but Wallace wasn't listening. He was thinking about the truth, not just about his crimes, but about who he had been and who he was trying to become. He straightened his shoulders and exhaled slowly. For the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to control the outcome. He wasn't plotting or manipulating or calculating his advantage. He was simply ready to face whatever came next, one step at a time. Let's go, he said quietly, and stepped forward to meet his future. The parole hearing room was stark and cold, with gray walls that seemed to absorb what little warmth the fluorescent lights provided. A long wooden table dominated the space, behind which sat 5 stern-faced parole board members. Their expressions gave nothing away as they shuffled through thick stacks of papers. Peter Wallace stood before them, the chains at his wrists clicking softly as he adjusted his stance. His prison uniform was clean but worn, hanging loose on his frame. He kept his eyes forward, his posture straight but not defiant. In the back row of chairs, Judge Benjamin Davis sat silently observing. His presence wasn't required, but something had drawn him here. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, a need to see if the change he'd witnessed in Wallace was genuine. The head of the parole board, a woman with steel gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, cleared her throat. Mr. Wallace, we're reviewing your case today. She began reading from a document, her voice echoing in the quiet room. Multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, corporate theft. The list went on, each crime a reminder of his past life. Wallace didn't flinch or look away. He stood there, accepting each word as truth. Theft of pension funds affecting over 10,000 employees. Market manipulation. Tax evasion. Some of the other board members watched Wallace's face, perhaps expecting to see denial or shame. Instead, they saw only steady acceptance. When the list finally ended, the room fell into silence. The head of the board looked up from her papers. Mr. Wallace, do you have anything you'd like to say to this board? Wallace took a breath. His chains clinked softly as he clasped his hands together. 2 years ago, he would have launched into a carefully rehearsed speech, designed to manipulate and convince. But now, he simply spoke the truth. I was a man who thought he was above the law, he said, his voice clear and steady. I was wrong. The simplicity of his statement seemed to fill the room. One of the board members blinked in surprise, clearly expecting more. But Wallace remained silent, having said all he needed to say. In the back of the room, Davis gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible. The board members exchanged glances. The head of the board made a few notes on her paper. We'll review your case and make our decision, she said. You'll be notified within the week. Wallace nodded once. As the guard stepped forward to escort him out, his shoulders seemed to relax slightly. Whether he was granted parole or not, he had spoken his truth. For the first time in his life, that was enough. The warden's office was a stark contrast to the rest of the prison. While the cells were all concrete and steel, this room had wood paneling and a large desk that dominated the space. The morning light filtered through barred windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Peter Wallace sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his hands folded in his lap. 2 years of prison life had changed him physically, his designer suits replaced by prison garb, his once perfect hair now streaked with gray. But the biggest changes were in his eyes. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something quieter, more thoughtful. The warden, a heavyset man with thinning hair, shuffled through papers on his desk. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Finally, he looked up and cleared his throat. Well, Mr. Wallace, the warden began, adjusting his reading glasses. I've got your paperwork here from the parole board. He paused, studying Wallace's face. Congratulations. You're being released. Wallace felt his chest tighten. He'd imagined this moment countless times during his imprisonment, but the reality felt different. There was no rush of joy, no sense of triumph. Instead, a wave of uncertainty washed over him. You'll be processed out next week, the warden continued, his voice matter of fact. Your personal effects will be returned to you, and you'll need to check in with your parole officer within 24 hours of release. Wallace nodded, his throat dry. Thank you, sir. Back in his cell, Wallace began gathering his meager possessions. 2 years ago, he'd owned penthouses and sports cars. Now everything he owned fit into a single paper bag, a few letters, some books, a worn notebook filled with his thoughts and reflections. He picked up each item slowly, carefully. The Bible someone had given him during his first month. A photograph of his children from before everything fell apart, they hadn't visited once. A letter from Judge Davis that he'd read so many times the edges were worn. The cell that had been his home for 2 years suddenly felt foreign. He ran his hand along the cold concrete wall, remembering his first night here, how he'd raged against the confines of this space. Now, it was almost familiar. His hands remained steady as he continued packing. There was no one waiting for him on the outside, no family, no friends, no empire. His children had cut ties, his former associates had abandoned him, and his wealth was long gone. Yet somehow, the thought didn't terrify him anymore. The morning sun cast long shadows across the prison parking lot as Peter Wallace stepped through the heavy metal gates for the last time. He carried everything he owned in a small paper bag, some clothes, a few letters, and a worn paperback book. The guard who'd escorted him merely nodded and turned back inside, leaving Wallace alone in the cool morning air. The world seemed impossibly vast after 2 years of concrete walls and steel bars. Cars rushed by on the distant highway, their sounds carrying across empty fields. Wallace adjusted the collar of his plain white shirt, no designer labels anymore, and took a deep breath of fresh air. The bus station was just a simple concrete shelter with a metal bench, nothing like the luxury he once knew. A few other people waited there, none of them giving him a second glance. They didn't know who he was, and for the first time in his life, that felt like freedom. The young clerk behind the ticket window barely looked up from her phone. Her name tag read Sarah, but her expression said she'd rather be anywhere else. Bus leaves in 5 minutes, she announced to no one in particular, her voice flat with boredom. Wallace stood there, his paper bag clutched in one hand. The morning breeze ruffled his gray hair as he watched an old Greyhound bus pull up to the curb, its brakes squealing slightly. The door opened with a hiss. "You coming or not?" the clerk called out, finally looking up from her phone with mild irritation. Wallace glanced back at the prison walls one last time. They'd held him, changed him, taught him who he really was when everything else was stripped away. But they didn't define him anymore. The other passengers filed onto the bus, a mother with 2 children, an elderly man with a cane, a college student with headphones. Nobody knew he'd once commanded boardrooms and moved millions with a single phone call. Nobody cared. Wallace felt something unfamiliar tugging at the corners of his mouth, a genuine smile. Not the smirk he'd worn in courtrooms or the fake grin he'd flashed at cameras, but something real. The bus horn blared, an impatient sound cutting through the morning quiet. He climbed aboard, nodding to the driver, and found a seat near the middle. The worn fabric was nothing like his private jet's leather seats, but it felt right somehow. As the bus engine rumbled to life, Wallace settled back and watched the prison disappear through the dusty window. The world hadn't ended when he lost everything. It hadn't stopped when he went to prison. And now, as the bus pulled away from the curb, he realized it was just beginning. Wallace smiled again, this time at his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him wasn't a billionaire or a prisoner, he was just Peter Wallace, and that was enough. The morning bustle of downtown felt foreign to Wallace now. The streets he once ruled as a titan of industry now flowed around him like he was just another piece of urban debris. His worn shoes, plain leather instead of Italian craftsmanship, clicked softly against the familiar sidewalks. A group of suited executives brushed past, deep in conversation about quarterly projections and market shares. Wallace recognized one of them, James Peterson, his former VP of operations. Peterson's eyes flickered over him without a hint of recognition before returning to his smartphone. Wallace kept walking, passing the high-end stores where he used to drop thousands without a second thought. Through the gleaming windows, he caught his reflection, gray hair uncombed, clothes from a department store, shoulders slightly stooped. The man who used to command boardrooms had been replaced by someone who looked ordinary. Outside his old corporate building, Wallace Tower, they'd called it then, he paused. The giant glass structure stretched toward the sky, its windows reflecting the morning sun. The golden W that once crowned the entrance had been replaced by another company's logo. Security guards chatted near the revolving doors where he used to sweep in, trailing assistants and sycophants. For a moment, his hand twitched toward the entrance. He could walk in, announce himself, remind them all who he used to be. The thought felt hollow even as it formed. What would it prove? That he was still clinging to power that had slipped through his fingers like water? A young woman in a crisp suit hurried past him, coffee cup in hand, probably rushing to a morning meeting. She was focused, determined, just like he'd been at her age. But he saw something in her eyes he'd never had, purpose beyond the pursuit of power. Wallace stepped back from the entrance. The building's shadow no longer felt like a crown, it was just another shadow on just another street. The realization didn't sting like he'd expected. Instead, it felt like setting down a heavy weight he'd carried for too long. He turned away from the tower, merging back into the stream of pedestrians. Behind him, deals were being made, fortunes rising and falling, but none of it belonged to him anymore. And for the first time, that felt okay. The city hummed around him, not as a kingdom he'd lost, but as a place where people lived their lives, chased their dreams, made their mistakes, and moved forward. Just like he would have to do. Wallace walked away from his old building without looking back. The weight of his past stayed behind, leaving his steps lighter as he moved through streets that no longer needed to know his name. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Wallace stood in his simple button-down shirt and khakis, a far cry from his former tailored suits. Judge Davis approached from the side entrance, his robes replaced by a casual blazer and slacks. The same steps where Wallace had once strutted with arrogance now felt different under his feet. "Didn't expect to see you here," Davis said, his voice carrying the same measured tone Wallace remembered from the courtroom. Wallace turned, managing a small smile. "Old habits. This place. It changed everything." Davis crossed his arms, studying the man before him. The smirk was gone, replaced by something quieter, more genuine. "What now?" he asked simply. Wallace exhaled, looking out at the city skyline. The buildings he once viewed as monuments to his power now just looked like buildings. "I don't know," he admitted. "And for the first time, I'm okay with that." The honesty in his voice surprised even him. The constant need to control, to dominate, to know every move ahead, it had evaporated somewhere between his conviction and release. The uncertainty that would have once terrified him now felt strangely peaceful. Davis watched him carefully, noting the relaxed set of his shoulders, the absence of that desperate edge that had defined him during the trial. The man who had once mocked him from across the courtroom now stood as an equal, not in power or position, but in simple human dignity. "You know," Wallace continued, running a hand through his graying hair, "I spent my whole life thinking I had to be somebody. Had to prove something. Now I'm nobody, and it feels." He paused, searching for the right word. "Real." A police car rolled past, its presence no longer making Wallace flinch. He'd faced his consequences. The fear was gone. "I used to own half the buildings we can see from here," Wallace said, gesturing at the skyline. "Now I can't even afford a cup of coffee in most of them," he chuckled softly. "But I can breathe. Really breathe." Davis uncrossed his arms, his stern expression softening slightly. The transformation before him wasn't just in Wallace's words, it was in his entire being. The desperate hunger that had driven him to corruption had been replaced by something closer to peace. "So no grand plans?" Davis asked. "No schemes to rebuild?" Wallace shook his head. "Just going to take each day as it comes." "Maybe that's enough." The courthouse doors opened behind them as people streamed out, heading home for the day. None of them gave Wallace a second glance. He was just another face in the crowd now, and that anonymity felt like a gift. "I've got a small apartment," Wallace said. "It's probably the size of my old bathroom. But when I wake up in the morning, I don't have to pretend anymore. Don't have to be anything other than who I am. And who is that? Davis asked. I'm still figuring that out, Wallace replied. And for the first time, I'm okay with that. They walked in silence to a small cafe around the corner from the courthouse. It wasn't the kind of place Wallace would have been caught dead in during his previous life, just a simple coffee shop with worn wooden tables and mismatched chairs. The afternoon crowd had thinned out, leaving only a few patrons typing on laptops or reading books. Wallace ordered a plain black coffee, while Davis chose green tea. They settled at a table near the window, watching people hurry past on the sidewalk outside. The steam rose from Wallace's cup as he wrapped his hands around it, feeling its warmth. He hadn't touched his drink yet, instead staring into the dark liquid as if searching for answers. Do you believe in redemption? Wallace finally asked, his voice quieter than usual. The question hung in the air between them. Davis took a careful sip of his tea, his expression thoughtful but guarded. I believe in choices, he replied, setting his cup down with deliberate care. Wallace nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind those simple words. The judge wasn't offering him easy absolution or comfortable platitudes. Instead, he was reminding Wallace that every day brought new decisions, new opportunities to prove who he really was. The cafe's espresso machine hissed in the background as a barista prepared someone's order. Outside, a yellow taxi honked its horn. But between Wallace and Davis, the silence stretched on, filled with unspoken understanding. They sat there, two men who had started as adversaries, now sharing a moment of quiet reflection in a humble cafe. The power dynamics that had once defined their relationship had dissolved, replaced by something more complex, not quite friendship, but a mutual recognition of the long path Wallace had traveled. Wallace stood up from the cafe table, leaving his half-finished coffee behind. Judge Davis remained seated, watching him with steady eyes. The afternoon sun filtered through the cafe windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Thank you, Wallace said quietly, for everything. Davis simply nodded, his expression thoughtful but unrevealing. Wallace stepped out onto the busy sidewalk. The city hummed around him, cars honking, people rushing past, phones ringing. It was the same symphony of urban life he'd known for decades, but now it felt different. He wasn't above it anymore. He was part of it. His designer suits were gone, replaced by simple khakis and a plain blue button-down from a department store. His Italian leather shoes had been swapped for comfortable walking shoes. His gold watch was just a basic timepiece now. But the weight that had pressed down on his shoulders for so long, the constant need to prove himself, to win, to dominate, that weight was finally gone. He walked past his old building without turning his head. The glass and steel tower that had once been his kingdom held no power over him now. The doorman who used to snap to attention at his approach didn't even glance his way. He was just another face in the crowd. And for the first time in his life, that felt right. He stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. A young woman in a business suit rushed past him, phone pressed to her ear, talking about quarterly reports and deadline pressures. He recognized that desperate energy. He'd lived it for decades. But now he felt only compassion for her, not contempt. The walk signal lit up, and Wallace stepped forward with the crowd. He had no destination in mind. No empire to build. No deals to close. No power plays to execute. He was just walking, existing, breathing. He passed a small park where children played while their parents watched from nearby benches. In his previous life, he would have seen it as wasted space, prime real estate that could be developed into something profitable. Now he simply appreciated the sound of laughter and the splash of sunlight through the trees. His phone didn't ring anymore with urgent calls from lawyers or business partners. His calendar wasn't packed with meetings and galas. His name wasn't in the headlines or on the lips of news anchors. He was just Peter Wallace now. Not a titan of industry. Not a criminal. Not a cautionary tale. Just Peter. He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes, and kept walking. The future was uncertain, but for once, that didn't terrify him. He didn't need to control everything anymore. He didn't need to be the most powerful person in every room. He just needed to be himself. And finally, after all these years, that was enough. Wallace turned a corner, merging into the steady stream of pedestrians. Soon he was indistinguishable from anyone else on the sidewalk, just another person making their way through the day, one step at a time. If you enjoyed the story of Benjamin, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.